I was standing in my own driveway in Scottsdale, Arizona, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, watching a police cruiser pull slowly through my front gate, and I want to be clear about what I had done to deserve this. I had said no, that was it. A woman had knocked on my door, told me to sell her husband my Lamborghini for $1, and I had told her no and asked her to leave. 40 minutes later, there was a Scottsdale PD patrol car in my driveway and an officer walking toward me with a notepad. I stood there in the afternoon heat with my arms at my sides, thinking about the sequence of events that had led to this exact moment, and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite disbelief. It was something closer to the particular clarity that comes when a situation finally reveals exactly what it always was. My name is James Whitfield. I am 52 years old. I spent 22 years as an orthopedic surgeon, retired in 2018 at 48, and in March of 2021, I purchased a home in Harborview Estates, a gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona, because I had spent 2 decades working 100-hour weeks in operating rooms, and I had earned, in the most literal sense of that word, the right to live somewhere quiet and beautiful and entirely my own. Harborview Estates is the kind of neighborhood that delivers on that promise. Wide lots, mature desert landscaping, homes built with the specific attention to detail that comes when people have resources and use them well. The kind of place where you can sit on your back patio on a November evening with a glass of wine and watch the sun go down behind the McDowell Mountains and feel, with complete certainty, that the life you built was worth building. 1 month after I moved in April of 2021, I purchased a Lamborghini Urus. Pearl white exterior, tan leather interior, custom sound system. I had wanted one for 11 years. In my surgical career, I had driven sensible cars because sensible cars were what a responsible surgeon with long shifts and early mornings drove. I had told myself for 11 years that when I retired, when the career was finished and the obligations were met, I would buy the car I actually wanted. So I did. The Urus sat in my 3-car garage when it wasn't being driven, which was most of the time, and when it was being driven, it was on weekend mornings on the empty desert roads north of Scottsdale when the light was good and the temperature was reasonable and there was nobody around to bother. It was not a statement. It was not a performance. It was a car I had worked 22 years to afford, and I loved it with the specific and uncomplicated joy of a person who has finally done the thing they promised themselves they would do. My next-door neighbor was a man named Robert Ashford, 64 years old, retired airline pilot, 31 years flying international routes for a major carrier, now spending his retirement doing woodworking in his garage and growing tomatoes in his backyard with the same methodical attention he had brought to transatlantic flight paths. Robert was the first real friend I made in Harborview Estates. We had the particular ease of 2 people who had both spent their careers inside systems that demanded precision and had both retired into the relief of not being responsible for anything except what they chose to be responsible for. We had coffee across the fence most Saturday mornings. He had noticed the Urus the day it arrived and said, with the understated approval of a man who respected quality, that it was a serious piece of machinery. I told him I had waited 11 years for it. He said that was about right. That was the beginning of what became, over the following 2 years, one of the better friendships of my adult life. The HOA welcome meeting was in May of 2021, 6 weeks after I moved in. I went because I had been told it was expected and because I am not, by nature, someone who avoids obligations simply because they are inconvenient. The meeting was held in the Harborview Estates clubhouse, a well-appointed room with a long conference table and framed photographs of the community's various landscaping awards on the walls. There were about 20 residents present. At the head of the table, running the meeting with the focused efficiency of someone who considered this the most important room she had been in all week, was Diane Cosgrove. Diane was 58 years old, a former insurance executive from Phoenix who had moved to Harborview Estates 6 years earlier and had been HOA president for the past 4. She was polished in the way that certain professional women are polished, every element of her presentation deliberate and controlled, and she ran that meeting the way I imagined she had once run quarterly reviews, with an agenda, a timer, and an absolute intolerance for deviation from either. She introduced herself to me after the meeting with a firm handshake and the specific evaluating look of someone taking inventory. She told me the community had very clear standards about exterior maintenance, vehicle storage, and driveway aesthetics. She handed me a printed copy of the HOA guidelines, 41 pages, and told me page 17 covered the garage and driveway provisions specifically. I thanked her, took the document, and went home. I read page 17. I was in compliance with everything on it. I put the document in a drawer and did not think about Diane Cosgrove again for approximately 13 months. Frank Cosgrove made his first appearance at the neighborhood 4th of July barbecue in 2022. He was 61, semi-retired, with the particular energy of a man who had spent his career in competitive environments and had not entirely figured out what to do with that energy in retirement. He was outgoing in the aggressive way of someone who mistakes volume for warmth, and he worked the barbecue the way a politician works a room, hand on the shoulder. Eye contact held a beat too long, the kind of attention that feels like interest but is actually appraisal. He found me near the drink table, introduced himself as Diane's husband, and we had a perfectly pleasant 15-minute conversation about retirement and Scottsdale summers and the McDowell Mountain trails. And then he looked past me toward my driveway, where the Urus was parked, because I had driven it over rather than walking the half block, and his expression changed. "Is that yours?" he said. "It is," I said. He walked over to it without being invited, walked around it slowly, the full perimeter, the way you walk around something you are already calculating the price of. He looked at the wheels. He looked at the interior through the window. He straightened up and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. "I'll buy it from you," he said. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He was not joking. He told me he had been looking for a white Urus for 2 years and hadn't found the right one. He said he would give me $80,000 for it right now. The car had cost me $240,000. I told him I appreciated the offer, but the car wasn't for sale. He nodded like a man filing information away rather than accepting it, and we moved on to other conversation, and I finished my drink and walked home and thought nothing more of it. He came back in August of 2022, knocked on my door on a Saturday morning while I was having coffee. He had brought the offer down to $60,000. He said something about the market shifting, depreciation, the cost of maintenance on a high-performance vehicle. I told him again, politely, that the car was not for sale at any price because I did not want to sell it. He nodded the same way he had at the barbecue, like a man receiving data he intended to find a use for, and left. He came a third time in October of 2022. The offer was $40,000. I told him I was not going to sell the car and asked him not to come back with another offer. He stood on my front step for a moment with an expression I can only describe as recalibrating. Then he said, very quietly, "You'll regret not taking my offer while it was on the table." He said it without heat. He said it the way someone states a forecast. Then he turned and walked back down the driveway, and I watched him go, and then I closed the door and stood in my front hall for a moment thinking about what, exactly, that sentence had meant. I decided it meant nothing, or nothing I needed to worry about. I was wrong about that. The first HOA violation letter arrived in January of 2023. It cited a single violation. My garage door had been left in the open position for 22 minutes beyond the permitted window on the afternoon of January 9th. I read that sentence twice because it took me a moment to understand that a permitted window for how long a garage door could remain open was a thing that existed. I went back to page 17 of the HOA guidelines. It was there, buried in subsection 4, paragraph 3. Garage doors in the open position during non-use periods constituted an aesthetic violation if maintained for longer than 15 minutes. The fine was $200. I paid it, not because I agreed with it, but because $200 was not worth a dispute, and I made a note to watch the garage door timer. The second letter arrived in March of 2023. The Urus was parked 2 inches past the permitted driveway boundary line. I went outside with a tape measure. The car was within the line. I measured 3 times. I wrote back to the HOA with my measurements and a photograph with a measuring tape in frame. I received no response, and no fine was ultimately levied, but the letter was now in my file. The third letter arrived in June of 2023. This one came with an $800 fine. A neighbor had allegedly complained that I had used a guest parking space in violation of HOA guest parking protocols, specifically that the Urus had been parked in a designated guest spot for a period exceeding the permitted duration while my garage was occupied by a contractor vehicle. I walked directly to Robert Ashford's front porch. Robert had been outside that entire evening. He told me flatly that he had not complained to the HOA about anything, that he had seen no one else outside making any kind of observation of my driveway, and that as far as he could tell the guest parking spot in question had been empty all evening, except for approximately 40 minutes when my contractor's truck was using it while the Urus was parked behind it in my own driveway, which was entirely within the guidelines. I thanked Robert and went inside and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the 3 letters lined up in front of me. January, March, June. Every single violation involved the Urus or my driveway. Every single one had arrived after Frank Cosgrove's 3rd visit. I picked up my phone and called Victor Salinas. Victor was 57, a civil litigation attorney in Scottsdale with 30 years of experience and the specific unhurried quality of a man who had seen enough cases to know which ones were going somewhere and which ones weren't. I had used him once before, a real estate matter in 2019, and I trusted his judgment. I told him about the 3 letters, the timeline, Frank's visits, and Frank's parting comment in October. Victor listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Don't pay the $800 fine yet, and save everything, every letter, every envelope, every photograph. If this is what it looks like, you're going to want a complete record from the beginning." I asked him what it looked like. He said, "It looks like someone using institutional authority to conduct a personal campaign, which is a very specific kind of problem with a very specific kind of remedy." I told him I understood. I started saving everything that same afternoon. 3 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in September of 2023, Diane Cosgrove knocked on my front door. I opened it and she was standing on my front step in a blazer, holding a folder, with the composed expression she wore to HOA meetings. She said she needed to speak with me about a community matter. I stepped aside and let her in because I am not the kind of person who conducts difficult conversations on a doorstep, and whatever this was, I wanted to hear it clearly and completely. She sat down at my kitchen table without being invited to do so, opened the folder, and began reading from a document that described, in the formal language of an HOA communication, a pattern of concerns that had been raised by multiple community members regarding vehicle aesthetics in the Harborview Estate's common visual environment. I listened to the entire thing without speaking. When she finished reading, she set the document down and looked at me directly. "James," she said, "the community has reached a point where we feel the Urus is creating an aesthetic tension that is difficult to resolve within the existing guidelines framework." I looked at her. "Aesthetic tension," I said. "It draws a level of attention that some residents find inconsistent with the community's character," she said. "Diane," I said, "it's a white car. It sits in my garage. I drive it on weekends." She adjusted the folder on the table. "I understand this may feel disproportionate, but community harmony requires a degree of consideration for shared visual standards." She paused. "Frank has mentioned that he would be willing to take the vehicle off your hands as a gesture of goodwill to the community for $1, so there's no question of financial pressure." I sat with that for a moment. "Diane," I said slowly, "that car is worth $240,000. The community's comfort," she said, without any change in her expression, "is worth more than a car, James." I stood up. "I'd like you to leave my home," I said. I said it quietly and I said it once. Something changed in her face. Not embarrassment, not surprise, something colder than both of those things. She gathered her folder, stood, and walked to the front door. She paused with her hand on the doorframe and turned back. "You're going to wish you'd been more cooperative," she said, the same words Frank had used in October, the same flat, forecasting tone. I closed the door. 40 minutes later, a Scottsdale PD patrol car came through my front gate. The officer who stepped out was a man named Mendez. He was professional and unhurried, with the specific demeanor of someone who had responded to enough neighborhood disputes to have developed a reliable instinct for what was real and what wasn't. He introduced himself, told me a complaint had been called in alleging that I had threatened a community member during a dispute, and asked if I could tell him what had happened. I told him everything: the 3 violation letters, Frank's 3 visits and 3 rejected offers, Diane's visit that afternoon, the $1 demand, my request that she leave, all of it in order without editorializing. Mendez listened and took notes. When I finished, he asked, "Did you raise your voice at any point?" "No," I said. "Did you make any physical gesture she could have interpreted as threatening?" "No." I stood up from my kitchen table, told her to leave, and held the door. He nodded and made a note. At that point, Robert Ashford appeared at the edge of my driveway. He had seen the patrol car from his front window and had come over, not intrusively, but with the quiet intentionality of a good neighbor who understands when a witness might be useful. He told Officer Mendez that he had been sitting on his front porch during the time of Diane's visit, had a direct line of sight to my front door, had seen Diane arrive and enter and leave, and had heard no raised voices at any point during the approximately 12 minutes she had been inside. Mendez thanked him and made another note. He went to speak with Diane. I watched from my front step as they had a conversation at the end of my driveway that lasted about 8 minutes. Then he came back to me. "There's no evidence of a threat," he said. "No report is being filed. The matter is closed as far as we're concerned." He paused, and what he said next was delivered quietly in the specific register of something being communicated off the record. "I'd suggest you document everything going forward, everything." He looked at me steadily for a moment to make sure I understood what he meant. I told him I would. He thanked me for my time, got back in the patrol car, and drove out through the front gate. I went inside and called Victor Salinas. I told him what had happened. There was a pause on his end that I had learned from our previous work together meant he was recalibrating the scale of what he was looking at. "She called 911, he said, "after a conversation in which she demanded you sell your car for $1 and you asked her to leave." "Yes," I said. Another pause. "James, a false police report is a criminal matter in Arizona. We are no longer talking about HOA harassment. We are talking about a significantly broader set of potential claims." He told me to write down everything I could remember about every interaction with both Frank and Diane, with dates, times, and as much verbatim dialogue as I could reconstruct. He told me to get the written documentation from Robert Ashford while the memory was fresh. He told me not to respond to any further HOA communications without his involvement, and he told me that he would be sending a cease and desist to the Blue Ridge Pines HOA board within the week. He meant Harborview Estates HOA, and I knew what he meant. The cease and desist went out in October of 2023. Diane Cosgrove's response was to issue 2 more violation letters within the same week. One cited an oil spot on my driveway surface that was, according to the letter, a violation of surface maintenance standards. The second cited the placement of a potted plant near my front door as inconsistent with entryway aesthetic guidelines. Victor reviewed both letters, added them to the file, and said, "Good, keep them coming." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Every letter she sends after receiving a cease and desist is documented evidence of willful continuation. She is building our case for us." In November of 2023, I received an unexpected call. The name on my screen was Patricia Ewan. Patricia was 55 years old, a CPA who served on the Harborview Estates HOA board as treasurer. I had spoken to her twice at community meetings and found her to be a careful and straightforward person who took her role seriously and seemed, on both occasions, faintly uncomfortable with some of the directions the board was taking under Diane's leadership. She asked if she could meet with me privately. I said yes, and we met at a coffee shop on Scottsdale Road on a Wednesday morning. Patricia arrived with a large envelope and the careful expression of someone who has made a decision they found difficult and is committed to following through on it. She told me she had been on the HOA board for 3 years, and that over the past 8 months, she had become increasingly uncomfortable with actions Diane had taken that Patricia believed exceeded the board's legitimate authority and had crossed into conduct she was not willing to continue to be associated with. She slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a printed selection of internal HOA board communications, emails between Diane and Frank going back to November of 2022. I read them at the table while Patricia drank her coffee and said nothing. The emails were explicit in a way that surprised even me. Frank had written to Diane in November 2022, 2 weeks after his third rejected offer, asking her to use her board position to make things sufficiently difficult for me that I would reconsider selling. He used the phrase, "make it uncomfortable." In a February 2023 email, 3 weeks after the first violation letter arrived, he wrote that things were progressing well and asked Diane to keep the pressure consistent. In a July 2023 email, 2 months before Diane's visit to my home, Frank wrote, "Get the car out of his hands before the end of the year." Diane's responses throughout were brief and businesslike. "Understood. We'll handle, working on it." The language of a professional executing a plan. I set the emails down and looked at Patricia across the table. "Why are you giving me this?" I said. "Because what they did is wrong," she said simply, "and because I've been on that board long enough to know that if I don't say something now, I'll regret it for a long time." I thanked her, took the envelope, and drove directly to Victor's office. Victor read the emails at his desk while I sat across from him. When he finished, he set them down, leaned back in his chair, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at me. "James," he said, "this just became a very different case." He explained. The emails established a direct conspiracy between Frank and Diane to use HOA authority as an instrument of personal leverage against me. They connected Frank to every violation letter as an instigating party. They connected Diane to a scheme that went well beyond overzealous HOA enforcement into deliberate, coordinated harassment. And they provided documentary evidence of intent, which was the element that transformed a harassment claim into something with significantly more legal and financial weight. "Frank is now a co-defendant," Victor said, "and these emails are Exhibit A." Victor filed the civil suit in December of 2023. The claims were harassment, abuse of HOA authority, civil conspiracy between Diane and Frank Cosgrove, and filing a false police report. Frank was named as a co-defendant. The HOA board was named as a respondent on the authority abuse claims. Patricia Ewan was not named anywhere in the filing, at her request and with Victor's agreement, because her cooperation had been voluntary and her position on the board gave her ongoing access to information that remained useful. The Harborview Estates community was a small and well-networked place, and word of the filing moved through it quickly. Patricia told me that at the December board meeting, which she attended as usual, the atmosphere had been what she described as the specific quiet of people who have just understood that something is more serious than they thought. 3 board members had asked Diane privately whether she wanted to address the filing. Diane had told them the matter was being handled by the HOA's insurance carrier and that there was nothing to discuss. The insurance carrier had, according to Patricia, reviewed the emails and reached their own conclusions about the case's likely trajectory. Diane retained a defense attorney named Margaret Hollies, who had a strong reputation in Scottsdale civil litigation. Victor told me, after reviewing Hollies's initial filings, that she was a capable attorney who was working with a very difficult set of facts and appeared to know it. Her early motions were competent and professional and did not suggest any path to dismissal of the core claims. The deposition of Diane Cosgrove took place on February 14, 2024, in a conference room at Victor's office. I was present. Diane arrived with Margaret Hollies and the composed, controlled presentation she brought to every formal setting. She was in a blazer. She had a leather portfolio. She sat down across from Victor, and I watched her arrange herself for the performance she had prepared. Victor is not a theatrical attorney. He does not raise his voice. He does not build to dramatic moments. He works the way a very precise instrument works, applying pressure in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, and then waiting to see what gives way. He spent the first 40 minutes on foundational questions: Diane's role as HOA president, her understanding of the board's authority, the process by which violation notices were generated and issued, her relationship with Frank, The timeline of the violation letters against my property. Diane answered everything smoothly, confidently, with the fluency of someone who had prepared carefully. Then Victor picked up the emails. He read them to her one by one, not the whole email, just the relevant line. Then he asked her to explain what Frank meant when he wrote that specific sentence. He asked her to explain what she meant in her response. He asked her to reconcile her description of the violation letters as standard enforcement actions with Frank's email describing them as things progressing well. Diane's answers got shorter. Then they got shorter again. By the fourth email, she was answering in single sentences. By the sixth, she was answering in single words. Margaret Hollies interjected with objections at regular intervals, and Diane took the opportunities to pause and recollect herself. But the recollection was taking longer each time and producing less each time, and everyone in the room could see it. Victor closed the deposition with one question. He set down the last email, folded his hands on the table, and looked at Diane Cosgrove directly. "Ms. Cosgrove," he said, "on September 14th, 2023, when you called 911 and reported that Mr. Whitfield had threatened you, was that call based on an actual threat, or was it based on the fact that he had refused to sell his vehicle?" Diane looked at Margaret Hollies. Margaret Hollies said nothing. The deposition ended 40 seconds later. The settlement conference was April 3rd, 2024. Margaret Hollies came without Diane. She was professional and direct and moved through the terms with the efficiency of someone who has accepted an outcome and wants to conclude it cleanly. The settlement was signed on April 18th. The terms were binding and complete. Diane and Frank Cosgrove, jointly and separately, paid $55,000 in total damages covering harassment, abuse of HOA authority, and the false police report. Of that amount, Frank paid $18,000 personally. Diane paid $12,000 personally. The HOA's insurance carrier covered the remaining $25,000 after their own review of the emails had produced a settlement recommendation that, according to Victor, had been both swift and unambiguous. All HOA fines issued against my property were voided and removed from the official record. A formal written apology from the HOA board was to be posted publicly on the community forum and displayed on the physical notice board in the clubhouse for 30 days. Both Diane and Frank signed a provision prohibiting any further contact with me, my property, or any matter related to my property. And Diane agreed to resign as HOA president within 30 days of the settlement's execution. She resigned in May of 2024. Patricia Ewan told me she had submitted a one-paragraph letter to the board and cleaned out her office the same afternoon. A retired architect named Howard Brennan was appointed interim president. He called me the following week to introduce himself, said he hoped things would be straightforward going forward, and asked if I had any concerns he should be aware of. I told him I had none, as long as the terms of the settlement were honored. He said they would be. They have been. On a Saturday morning in June of 2024, I pulled the Urus out of the garage, backed it down the driveway, and parked it in the sun in front of the house. I got out a bucket and some microfiber cloths, and I washed it in my own driveway on my own property in the full Scottsdale morning light, which was brilliant and hot and completely indifferent to the previous 8 months of everything that had happened. Robert Ashford came out of his front door with 2 cups of coffee, leaned on the fence between our properties, and handed one over. We stood there for a while not saying much. The McDowell Mountains were clear in the distance. The desert air smelled like warm stone and the specific dry heat that Scottsdale does better than anywhere else on Earth. "You know," Robert said finally, looking at the car, "that might be the most expensive dollar anyone never spent." I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes without thinking about it, the kind I had not had in quite a while. "I think you're right," I said. We drank our coffee. The car sat in the sun, pearl white, exactly where I had put it. I thought about what the previous 8 months had actually been about, and it was not about a car. It was never about a car. It was about a certain kind of person who looks at someone else's choices and decides that those choices require their approval, and when approval is withheld, reaches for whatever institutional lever is available to make the refusal painful enough to reverse. Diane had a title. Frank had a want. Together they had built something that they had convinced themselves was authority, but was actually just pressure dressed up in HOA letterhead. And pressure, when it is documented carefully and handled correctly, has a way of collapsing entirely under its own weight. The car is still in my garage. I drive it on weekend mornings on the desert roads north of Scottsdale when the light is good and the temperature is reasonable and there is nobody around to bother. It is exactly the car I promised myself I would buy when the career was finished and the obligations were met. Nobody is getting it for $1. Nobody is getting it at all. Now let me ask you something, because I think about this more than people might expect. Has anyone ever tried to pressure you into giving up something you worked hard for, something you earned and owned and had every right to keep? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to read every single one. And if this story made you want to go wash your car just to feel good about owning it, hit subscribe. New story dropping very soon, and I promise you, you are not going to want to miss it.